Today we are going to consider the end of the Holocaust and the liberation of the camps. Most of you, if you read your Berenbaum, that Auschwitz, the major death camp, was liberated by the Russians in January of 1945. But the camps that were in Germany had to wait until the spring of 1945 and were liberated both by Americans and by the British. We are most fortunate today to have one of the people that liberated Dachau with us. Dan Doughtery was born in Hutchinson, Minnesota. He's been married since 1951. And that means that in June of this year, he will be celebrating his 50th anniversary. He went to public schools in Austin, Minnesota, and graduated from Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota with a BA degree. He knew what his discipline was.
Sociology, I'd say that from John.
Sociology. Hear that?
I'm glad to hear that.
John's glad to hear that. So am I, as a sociologist. From 1943 through 1945, Dan was in the U.S. Army Infantry in France and Germany. He fought in 3 campaigns. He has a combat infantry badge and a Purple Heart. After the war, he took some additional schooling and became a life underwriter, writing insurance, and eventually owned his own insurance company in Nevada. Currently, Dan is involved with the Rotary Club in Roseville and serves on the board of directors. And he is the co-chairman of the International Service Committee. Those of you who are familiar with Rotary know that Rotarians send students and ambassadors all over the world. So that sounds like an exciting thing to be doing. Dan is also the publisher and editor of Second Platoon, which is a newsletter that recounts the activities, both current and past, of people that he served with in the Army. Looks like Dan also square dances. So Dan did not want us to go on and on and on with his vita, but I want to assure you that he also has a great many, shall we say, extracurricular activities. That it appears that not only was he a businessman and obviously a successful one, but also had a spirit of community service. He's been most generous to us in agreeing to come and talk to you and to explain his experiences. With him and preceding him will be our own Dr. John Steiner, who happened to be at the receiving end of Dan's liberation. Dr. Steiner will tell you about his experience, and then Dan is going to come up and talk about his experience and what it meant to him. But we are uniquely blessed to be able to have someone who was liberated at Dachau and also to have his liberator come and speak with us. So won't you welcome Dr. Steiner?
Well, for me personally, it's an honor for Dan Doughtery to come here and share his experiences of liberating Dachau with us. I have not met him personally because I was on the dying side at that particular point in time. And actually, because of the honor, I really have to put this on just to show my respect and gratitude. So not to make it just verbally, but also visibly. So around the time before the liberation on April 29, 45, I was in the sick barrack of Dachau, and you know that Dachau was the first concentration camp. And that's why I think it is historically very important that that liberated in terms of politically speaking, other by Americans and not the Russians, as far as I'm concerned. And particularly when you know the geopolitical situation immediately after World War II, you will find out that there's been quite a bit of tension growing between the Soviets and the Western Allies for very good reasons, which we won't go into because it's a thing which needs to be discussed separately. But coming back to the original point, just around that time I was actually not only very ill, but also felt that I was semi-conscious already, and gave myself about 10 days. But not more than that. I was not quite bitted. And during that particular time, the Americans came to liberate Dachau, which for all practical purposes saved my life. And I still remember, dimly as it may be, how I noticed, in just watching, perception was still very good, but my understanding was not too good, and my vision was fading. And I remember that after the liberation, lots of civilians and people in uniform ran through the barrack to look at us and be dismayed, and some of them threw some things at us which were food stuff, sorts of things. And a lot of people, of course, I didn't know the ranks then, but high-ranking people coming in just to, because that was a sensation. Dachau, everyone had heard about Dachau in the United States, even if relatively little was known, but enough was known in order for people to recognize that Dachau was one of the major concentration camps, and the first to boot. So that was, of course, a sensation for the American armed personnel and politicians. So I could see how many people actually ran through, and very few people stopped because the horror of it, what they saw. They were totally overwhelmed. And therefore people didn't stop to talk or to relate in a more personal way, but they just rushed through with a great speed. And then, of course, the liberators did not stay. They moved on to Munich. And then another group of people, personnel, came who then stayed and took charge of the camp and of the people whom they liberated, and gave first aid, and I still remember him. He was a captain at that time. And then I was in very bad shape, but for some reason or another, because of the treatment. And the first time, actually the second day after, or third day after liberation, I remember that someone came in civilian clothing, must have been from the Red Cross, and he insisted that I drink some red wine, which to me was kind of very strange. It was just, didn't fit into the whole situation. And I did it because, you know, I'm not that, I was very much into it. I was hungry, and wine was, but couldn't hurt me, so I did what they asked me to do. And then we were properly treated, and the most important thing is, which happened very immediately, in contrast to other camps which were liberated, that we were given very, very little food. And we couldn't understand it because no one had explained it to us. That's lives, but little did we know that at that particular time. Why? Why? Simply because we no longer people who had been starved for that length of time and emaciated and, if you will, skeletons, you know. I call it walking x-rays because I think I couldn't have weighed more than about 50, 60 pounds, believe it or not. And so we couldn't understand that, why they can be considered some sort of a continuation of starvation or starvation diet. And it was not explained to us. But then much later, after having read and compared all the various camps which were liberated where people were given a lot of food, who died? Why? Because the system could not. It was just like poison. The system could not digest it. So that particular person who was captain then was, I remember still the time when he was promoted to major because there was a big celebration. And now, of course, I can see this man really knew what he was doing. He was a tremendous physician, must have been a very insightful, skilled, expert physician, because most of the physicians had absolutely no experience with types like us, who were starved and in a stage of dying, just like myself, and I was by no means the only one who was virtually in comatose. But I wasn't, but many were. So the timing was right for people who were similarly situated as I was, but for many other people it was too late. And they died because they could not, they simply were in no position to survive under the circumstance in terms of what happened to them, the damage which had been caused to them prior to their liberation. So later when I amended, I was asked to become interpreter because I went to an English kindergarten and my mother translated Gone with the Wind from German into English. I'm sorry, from English into German. And, so it was spoken at home quite a bit, and my aunt and my mother spoke, particularly when I was very small, they spoke English together and talked about things which I was not supposed to hear or understand. And they did a very, very good job, actually. And so therefore, because of my background, I was asked to be one of the interpreters, but I could have been the only one. And then I went with these doctors and the nurses and all that. And that I won't forget also, because the first thing which I noticed with the American nurses, all of whom were officers, second or first lieutenants and above, but not very much higher, they had long red fingernails. And in that particular environment, after that, simply it just didn't fit in. It was just out of place. And for reasons which I could explain but won't, I noticed that. It was certainly looking very sexy, but except we've had other problems to think about and needs, which were hardly something which would turn us on at that particular point in time. But it was noticeable because it was so out of place. So then I went with these nurses to the various inmates who were in a very much worse shape than I was, and interpret to the medical team what ailed them and what could be done, and he was really tremendous up to a point. But I won't go much further because I don't want to take up any more time. Maybe later I can fill in some few things which Dan may want to ask me to, but right now I think I've said the most important thing, and now I'd like to leave the stage to the distinguished Dan. And he probably doesn't realize my gratitude, and I wish to God we could get together with all those people who liberated Dachau, who are still around, because many have died, and we want to think in gratitude of what they had done and what they, how many lives they saved, how much they saved. And it would be nice if we could get together, those of us who are still around, but our days may be counted, you know, by virtue of our chronological age. I don't feel as old as I am, believe me. So, but still, we feel that we are fading away, you know, fading voices. Our voices are fading. And therefore we need to take advantage of whatever energy we have left in order to spread the news and inform people who may not be ready for it, but still we inform them, because among the people who perhaps may not be open, the penny may not have dropped as yet, but eventually it may drop. And I guarantee you, some few years you may remember that you class and that you've learned from it and developed some insight which you may be able to apply in times of need. And I know that some people simply are not quite open to it yet, but eventually the chances are you will be, and those who are open and realize why it is important to take a course like this, what we are doing here, especially what is being done today, which is very positive. Liberation, of course, saved the lives of thousands, tens of thousands. This is a very happy day, a very happy day, a very, very happy day. And I want to thank again Dan and all his colleagues and friends for having done what they have.
My name is Dan Doughtery, and I served with the 45th Infantry Division in the 7th Army in France and in Germany. I was in a rifle company, C Company. I'm going to be talking about some of these names and numbers later on. We served in the 7th Army. That was in the southern part of the Western Front. And on the middle of March, the big campaign that would end the war began. We sat on the French-German border between Karlsruhe and Luxembourg. We started attacking the Siegfried Line on March 18th. This was the big defensive perimeter had built running from Switzerland all the way up north of the Baltic Sea. This was a gigantic tank trap. We could not go, the tanks who were with us could not go beyond that. And we went well into this, and then all the Germans who knew right where we were unloaded the mother of all artillery barrages on us, and we had 50 casualties that morning. Pat Malone is here today. He is a tanker, and here's a cartoon that I always enjoy. We'll go away and stop boys now that Jerry's got our reins. These are the tankers deciding it's time to leave. This is one of the famous cartoons by Bill Malden, and these are Willie and Joe here, the famous characters. The next big community area we got to was Aschaffenburg. The Third Army under Patton had announced that they had taken Aschaffenburg, which meant that the tanks came up to it, went around, and went on. And we arrived there and discovered that the place was a beehive of German activity, and there was a fanatic Major von Lambert there who rounded up 5,000 German soldiers. There were a lot of different institutions in Aschaffenburg. We read them this riot act: you will fight, you will erect dugouts and barriers and get supplies and win. Anybody who protested was shot. People who wanted to give up were shot. Officers who called in sick were shot. After about 3 days of trying to win at this place, the idea was conceived that we would have drop an ultimatum on the city of Aschaffenburg, which is just about a few miles southeast of Frankfurt, where you fly in. And this was an ultimatum that was put together by a fellow who was in our regimental headquarters. Your situation is hopeless. The following is requested immediately: raising of the white flag. It did absolutely no good, and we quite literally had to destroy Aschaffenburg, and they were burned out and artillery. Eventually, von Lambert did what he had punished others for, and he surrendered, but not before about 1,700 German soldiers were killed. We lost 3 in my company there. It just quite literally destroyed the town. Well, here we had come in from Germany. We were heading up toward Frankfurt. This is Aschaffenburg. And following Aschaffenburg, we go northeast, and we get up near the town of Fulda. We're moving very rapidly at this point because, keep in mind, this is practically the beginning of April. The war only lasts another 5 or 6 weeks. The ability of the Germans to defend the country is dropping every day. And I don't know who made these decisions, but all of a sudden we go, especially southeast, and the goal is Nuremberg. And on the way to Nuremberg, we come to, whoops, I have to go back. Right after Aschaffenburg, we had a little break, 3 days, in a little town in Germany, Eichstätt. I had a camera that was carried for me by the kitchen crew, and I got it out that day, and this is pretty much the 2nd platoon of C Company of the 157th Regiment. This fellow is a medic. This fellow is our platoon leader. This was our former platoon leader. Here was the platoon sergeant. The fellow at the top was Edward Wilkin, who, as a result of what he had done in the Siegfried Line, was subsequently but posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. I have identified everybody in the photo. Everybody's my platoon except this fellow. He turned out to have been 3rd platoon. I have accounted for all but 4 of them. You can't find 4 of them. Most of them are dead, but there were frequent reunions with a good many of the others. This is what you do when you are taking a rest. You pose with the local Fraulein. This was a little girl, Lonnie. We called her Hot Lonnie. She was just absolutely petrified because, of course, we were totally occupying this little town. Then we got haircuts, and this was a Belgian displaced person that was living in this little town who gave the haircut. And here are the guys in my platoon who are cleaning the rifle. This is Ben Ewing, lives up in Detroit. This is Byron Trevor in Winona, Minnesota. Jimmy Kelling back up in Seattle. I tracked all these guys down. On the way to Nuremberg, we come to Bamberg, which was a big horse center for the Nazis. Come to Nuremberg. We arrived there on April 15th. I was in the 45th Division. Also there was the 42nd Division and the 3rd Division, and the 3 divisions had it surrounded. If anybody but Hitler had been running the show, they would have surrendered, but instead they fought, and of course we just destroyed the city. On the first day there, we sat out on the bluffs and watched the American Air Force dive bomb the city. There was no opposing German Air Force. There was not even any ACAC. These were practice runs for these guys. They pounded away, and then we very slowly moved into the center of the city. It took us 4 days to reach the center. You can see it totally destroyed. And the final night, when we wanted a place to sleep, we had to walk way back out into the suburbs just to find a building. This is another one of Bill Malden's cartoons. Always reminds me of Nuremberg. This is what Nuremberg looked like today. This is what we left it as. It was totally destroyed, total rubble when we left, and had to be completely rebuilt. Well, the 42nd and the 45th Division are now just hell-bent for Munich. The goal is to get there as soon as possible so as to deny the Germans an opportunity to organize a defense, as they had here. We lost 3 men at Nuremberg, and we get to the Danube River on April 26th and find that all the bridges are blown. And so they bring up what was in World War II called an Army duck. And it could go in land or in water, and here are the wheels, and then when you get down to the water, here's the propeller, and they would switch back and forth. And this is what took us across the Danube, or what at least was intended to. The one I was in got halfway across and the engine conked out. And we quite literally went sailing down the Danube with the engineer frantically trying to get the engine restarted. And I don't know how long we went. I remember it as about 20 minutes, but I think probably more like 10. We were literally a sitting duck, because if we had run into a pocket of resistance, they could have just blown us out of the water. Eventually got the engine started again to the other side. I was the ranking sergeant in the group, and I said, I don't think we ought to go back up the river. The Army's moving so fast. So we went off at a right oblique, and we found our unit the next day. So you can see we had gone a long way. Pat Malone is here. He was a tank, a gunner in a tank, Sherman tank. He's one of our guests here today. We were frequently riding tanks, and he mentioned that they were frequently hauling the 42nd Division. Who knows? Pat may have been on this particular tank. We had to be riding something just to keep up with the Germans, because their defense was just collapsing. And on the morning of Sunday, April 29th, we'd slept that night in a woods in Bavaria, right outside Munich, and we came in to get our rations. These are K rations from World War II. You would immediately eat, and then the Army field jacket had a deep pocket on the left and one on the right, and you would put lunch in one and supper in the other. There were 4 cigarettes in each of these in addition to the food. Each day that we fought, they gave us a free pack of cigarettes, a juicy fruit stick of gum, a box of matches, and a Hershey tropical chocolate bar. And I didn't smoke, so I had a standing swap arrangement for the candy, for the cigarettes. I don't know if you know the story, but when the World War II started, the War Department went to the Hershey Chocolate Company and said, we want you to manufacture a product for us that can withstand the cold winters of Europe and the hot steaming jungles of the Pacific. And the Hershey Company did that by extracting all the flavor and replacing it with preservatives. Just terrible. But cigarettes were very important in World War II. A lot of people smoked. And here's Willie and Joe again, in the heat of battle, discovering they've run out of cigarettes because their ammunition pouches, where they should have ammunition, are all full of cigarettes. Well, the reason I remember that morning is that something very unusual happened. The officer said, as we came in to get our rations, he said, guys, gather around, I have to give you special orders. And he was alerting us to the fact that the division was in the vicinity of a concentration camp. And my recollection is that he told us that in the interest of the war crimes trial that we're going to follow the war, it was very important that we take all possible prisoners alive. In other words, the Army wants it. I've never been able to find confirmation of what it was we in the 1st Battalion were told, but I took this right out of the journal for the 3rd Battalion of our regiment. They were very much involved in the liberation of Dachau. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the regiment notified them that Dachau may be very important military and politically. Be very careful of operations in this sector. At 6:35 in the morning, the company battalion confirmed that they had informed the 4 companies of this. At 6:40, the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion informed the commanding officer of I Company. I Company was charged specifically with liberating Dachau. Told him to be very careful as possible at the concentration camp to try and capture all documents intact as possible. And then finally at 8:15 in the morning, orders to the battalion and to the company, upon capture of Dachau, post an airtight guard, allow no one to enter or leave. In other words, the Army didn't want to have prisoners, GIs, SS, civilians, whoever, rampaging through this place looking for souvenirs, ransacking the records. So they were doing everything they could to seal it off. Well, regardless of what it was we were told, and it was something similar to this, I'm sure, it didn't mean anything to us. We didn't know what a concentration camp was. I don't remember the name Dachau, it didn't being mentioned, but if it was, it would have meant nothing to us at the time. And besides, C Company was in the reserve in our battalion that day, and my battalion, the 1st Battalion, was in reserve in the regiment. So we were like back where you like to fight the war as far back as possible. But about 1 o'clock or so, early afternoon, our runner came to us and said, I was standing there when he came, and he said, C Company, that's us, is going into a concentration camp to relieve I Company, right here. And then he said, because I Company has gone berserk. Those were his exact words. We, our C Company in the 1st Battalion, were being taken out of our sector to go over to the 3rd Battalion to help out I Company. And we have to hike over there. And on the way over, I just wanted to share with you some of the history of the Dachau camp. Hitler came to power at the end of January 1933. He was sharing power with Hindenburg. There continued to be huge demonstrations against Hitler and the Nazis in the streets of Germany, the communists, the socialists, the social democrats. Great big clashes with the police. At the end of February, the Reichstag building, where the parliament building for their assembly, burns to the ground one night. Hitler immediately blames it on the communists, and they use this event to build up the notion that there's an emergency, we have to have emergency powers given to the government. And by the end of March, they were able to get through the Reichstag, what was now called the Reichstag Decree. Effectively ended representative government, any form of democratic government in Germany. And from that moment on, Hitler was in charge, and it was just a matter of cementing his foundations. The last member of the Reichstag who voted against the Reichstag decrees died about 2 months ago. And there was a good bit of publicity about it in Germany. One of the provisions of the Reichstag decree, protective custody, is a coercive measure of the secret state police to protect the state against subversive activities. This enabled the police to take into custody anybody they wanted, hold them for 90 days, and not bring any charges. Kind of a distant delight. And the roundup began. Here's a roundup in Munich. In the Munich area, the consequence of this all over Germany was to flood the jails of Germany, because they knew exactly who they wanted to round up: socialists, social democrats, communists, intellectuals, clergymen, anybody who was to be an intellectual opponent of National Socialism. And they began to open camps, and in the Munich area, where the commissioner of police was Heinrich Himmler at the time, who would subsequently become head of the SS, they reopened an abandoned powder factory by the little town of Dachau. And this is one of the first assemblies of the prisoners who were coming in. You see they each got to bring a little suitcase with them. This is the first guard at Dachau. These are not SS. This is the Bavarian State Police. One of the early lineups there. And then in 1937, the decision was made to enlarge some of the camps and to close others. And Dachau was enlarged. And of course, they had a handy workforce. Here they are in their striped uniforms, building, and these are the barracks that they built. And this is what they built. It's a large rectangle surrounded by electrified barbed wire fence. There are 17 barracks up this side, 17 down this side, and down in the end you'll see one of 7 large guard towers that were on the perimeter of the camp. We're looking north here, and in addition to this guard tower, there were 3 down the east side and there were 3 down the west side. Here is a photo of the prisoners coming forward in the morning to get their work assigned for the day. And then in 1942, still Germany in control of virtually all of Europe. They've started their retreat from Russia, but they're controlling virtually all of Western Europe. Still very flush with victory, as you can see in this photo. Himmler himself, this is Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, visits Dachau. He had a particular interest always in the experiments that were being run at Dachau. Much of these were disclosed after the war. Just heinous experiments run on prisoners. In about 1942, the SS discovered that they were in competition with the government, with the Wehrmacht, the army, with industry for personnel and for supplies. And they realized they had all these prisoners in these camps, and so the decision was made to try to make profit centers out of it, to generate some supplies for use by the SS or things that they could sell. The fellow in charge of that is right here. He was Oswald Pohl, P-O-H-L. He was one of Himmler's main deputies. He was in charge of all the economic activity in the concentration camp. In the last year or two, he was really the guy who was running the show in the camps. Himmler, shortly after he was captured, committed suicide. Pohl was captured, he was tried, he was convicted, and he was hung in 1948. Well, we're approaching the camp from the southwest, and up ahead on the left we see there are a lot of boxcars. And we get up to them and make the absolutely horrifying discovery that they're full of corpses. These are just totally emaciated bodies, skin and bones. There wasn't an ounce of fat or muscle left on them. We would walk up to those boxcars and just stand there and stare. And nobody had anything very profound to say. We would say, my God, and then we would move on to the next boxcar and repeat this. 39 boxcars with 2,300 corpses. This fellow on the left is Tony Cardinale. Tony was 42nd Division there that day, and he is well known as the GI who spotted this fellow alive in one of the boxcars. And Tony told me, I asked Tony to come here today to help, but he lives in Lodi, but he was unable to come. He said he just barely saw the hand moving, and he hollered out, "Hey, Colonel, here's a live one." And this is a Lieutenant Colonel, battalion commander, removing this fellow from the boxcar. Well, at the time, we have no idea about the origins of this train. But we now know the whole story thanks to a Frenchman by the name of Francois Bertrand, who was a prisoner on that train. It was Himmler's orders that the prisoners not fall into the hands of the advancing Allied armies. They were really embarrassed when the Russians overran Auschwitz. And so they made a deliberate policy to remove the prisoners. And this train, the history of this train, belongs as much to Buchenwald as it does to Dachau. Because Buchenwald was liberated on April 11th, and then from April 6th to April 10th, 8 transports with almost 30,000 prisoners left Buchenwald, headed for other camps. They were going to Flossenburg, Dachau, Bierstadt. Bierstadt was the first camp that John Steiner went into down in Czechoslovakia. Keep in mind that during this, the Allied Air Forces are just pounding away at the German railway system, and so these trains are continually being delayed and rerouted. Many of these troop movements took place in the winter of 44-45. You would have thought that by this time the Germans would have been devoting all their effort to defending the homeland. Here they are diverting an incredible amount of resources to moving prisoners. This was the worst German winter in 40 years, 44-45, and many of these prisoner movements became just absolute horror stories. The train we're interested in left on April 7th with 4,500 prisoners headed for Flossenburg. Another train that left for Dachau on April 9th, 4,800, arrived at Dachau. So the two that arrived at Dachau are these two. The one I'll comment on this later. The one we're especially interested in is right here. Francois Bertrand, one of the French prisoners from Buchenwald that was put on this train, had a little tablet and a pencil, things he had, and he kept track of the names of the towns they went through, and where there was a clock, he wrote down the time. This Buchenwald is up here. It is serviced by the railroad station at Weimar. That's where Franz Liszt wrote his beautiful music. They are marched from the camp to the railroad station about 5 kilometers. It maybe needs a little focusing. And 60 prisoners are shot on the way to the railroad station. The 4,500 prisoners are put in 59 boxcars. That's about 75 people per car. And they head east toward Flossenburg, which was a major camp over near the Czech border. Here, however, it is rerouted, goes down, this is Czechoslovakia, goes down into Czechoslovakia, and back into Germany, and it comes out at Nannerring. They are there for 5 nights in Nannerring, and while they're there, prisoners are taken off and shot. About 2/3 of them are buried in local cemeteries in the area. The other 200 or 300 are taken out to a quarry dump doused with petrol and incinerated. We know that when it left Nannerring for Munich and Dachau, there were 3,100 prisoners. So it means it started out with 4,500 at Buchenwald. It's now down to 3,100. We know it had started 59 boxcars. It ends up at Dachau with 39. So as they went along and the prisoners died off or were shot, they abandoned boxcars along the way. They get to Dachau at 2 o'clock in the morning on April 28th. We got there the next day on April 29th. We know there were 2,300 corpses in the train. We know there were 3,100 on the train when it left Nannerring. It suggests there are approximately 800 survivors. They must have been just absolutely walking skeletons, or as John calls them, walking x-rays. Here is the excerpt from the Commandant's Journal for April 28th, right here. And here from Königshagen, Buchenwald, 816 prisoners had arrived. Here is the other train that we noted from Buchenwald. That train got as far as Pricing. They abandoned the train and they marched them the rest of the way. It was about 25 miles and about almost 1,600 of them. So out of about 9,000 prisoners who started on these two trains. There's 1,600 and 800, about 2,400 survived. This is Hans Mierbach. He was the S officer in charge of the train. He was an Obersturmführer, that's a first lieutenant in our lingo. He had served previously in Berlin and at Auschwitz. And after the war, he is tried for these crimes, including this train. In his trial, he contended that no more than 500 prisoners had died en route. No more than 500. It didn't do him any good. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and he was hung in 1909. Well, we leave the train, but I can't emphasize too much the impact it had on the soldiers. Some of the GIs became very distraught. They were crying and vomiting. Others became enraged. They were yelling and cursing. They looked at the boxcars and they said, whoever did this just doesn't deserve to live. Some became very emotional, and as you'll see later on, inside the camp acted on that emotion. And now we arrive. This is the Dachau concentration camp. Here is the protective custody area where the prisoners were, John Steiner and others. I think the infirmary was right here, John, I'm not certain. This is surrounded by electrified barbed wire fence. Here's the guard tower there, and then there's 3 guard towers, 3 down here. This is the only entrance to the protective custody area. Each day, a wagon, a work detail would go around, collect the corpses of those who had died that night, go out this gate, and go up here in the woods where the crematorium was. Some of the prisoners referred to that as Barracks X. The main gate to the camp is right, I think right here. We came in over here. I Company came in over here. We got inside the camp, and I remember the officers saying, okay guys, fan out and look for guards. And some of our men went to the right, some straight ahead, and I and some others went to the left. And we very quickly find ourselves up in this area. This is where the prisoners were. The rest of this is a huge SS military post. All of this is SS housing and all the infrastructure that goes along with a big military operation. I believe there were over 100 SS installations in Bavaria. They were all administered out of Dachau. It was known as the Dachau system, so it was a big administrative center for it. We got up in this area, and you can't see it very well, but there is a building up there with a white roof. And imposed on that was a Red Cross. And that was the SS hospital. Separating the SS hospital from the coal yard, where the tracks came in, and they brought the rail cars in and dumped the coal, which is what they used for fuel, was a high masonry wall. And we walk up to this wall and find just another incredible sight. There's about 8 or 10 reporters standing there looking at a mound of corpses. The army, of course, knew where Dachau was, and presumably in anticipation of the liberation, they had assembled this media group. They were all newspaper men from all over the world, South Africa, Australia, all the Allied, and had brought them in just as soon as the camp was secure. In fact, it wasn't secure by this time because we were still rounding up guards, but they were standing around this mound of corpses. And it was about 2 or 3 feet high and about 7, 8 yards across. And these were the SS. Nobody there to explain any of this to any of us. We presumed, and it turned out to be correct, that this was I Company's handiwork, and it was. While we're standing there, one of the corporals in my platoon crawls over the bodies, whips out his hunting knife, and cuts off a finger. He wanted an SS ring for a souvenir. The reporters just about went bonkers. One of them hollered out, hey, you can't do that. Well, it was already done. I cite that because there was a big investigation of the killing of the guards. And in the report on the investigation, mention is made that the guards shot at the wall, that 2 of them had fingers missing. And so it helped me determine exactly where I was in the camp. I Company, let's go back to them. We came in, C Company came in somewhere around 4 o'clock, 4 to 4:30, I think. Some of our guys say we were there by 2. I don't think that's right, but it doesn't make much difference. But we know I Company got in there about noon to 1 o'clock. They were in there about 2-3 hours ahead of us. They had come in this area as well, pretty much following in the railroad tracks. The battalion commander came with them. He didn't know whether or not the SS was choose to defend the camp. He figured that if they were, they would train their guns on the main gate, and so he said, we're not going in the main gate, and they went in over the wall over here. I Company then works their way across all these buildings down to the prison. There are a lot of buildings there. It takes a lot of time to ferret out the guards. There were several hundred guards still there. They think about 200 or 300. And they eventually, well, first of all, when you take prisoners of war, you have to do something with them. And so they separated Wehrmacht troops there. That's the regular German army troops, and there were also SS troops there. I Company separated the army from the SS, and they were holding the SS in this coal yard right on the other side from the hospital. The army troops they sent back to another location. And so they're going all across here, and they eventually come down to the crematorium and down to the camp. Unbeknownst to I Company, at about 3:30 in the afternoon, troops of the 42nd Division come in the main gate. Waiting at the main gate to surrender the camp is the acting commandant and a representative of the Swiss Red Cross. And the formal surrender of the camp is made in this area to a brigadier general of the 42nd Division. It was pretty much after the fact, because by this time almost all the guards have been up. But eventually then you have troops of the 45th and the 42nd Division mingling here. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who was the battalion commander in our 3rd Battalion, has written that he remembers standing here and he heard this huge roar come out of the camp. And it just continued like a rumbling war. And he turned to his interpreter and said, what's going on? And he said, Colonel, they are killing the collaborators. Each of these buildings had a Kapu who was in charge, who did the bidding of the SS. Many of them were German prisoners, sadistic folks. You can be sure they were not loved. And Sparks says you could see bodies being tossed in the air. While the 42nd and the 45th Division troops are mingling here, the prisoners point out that there are guards in Guard Tower B. And they just pointed up there and said, guards. And so they got them to come down. 8 guards came down out of Guard Tower B. They were immediately shot by some combination of troops of the 42nd and the 45th Division. The officers who gave statements about this later said they had no chance to stop it. It was very spontaneous. It was all over in just a few seconds. Some of the SS fell backwards into the moat. I forgot to mention, is a stream that the Germans channeled, and it served as a moat to divide the protective custody from the military portion of it. Well, we're going to work our way back over to the wall, but in the meantime, I wanted to share with you some of the features of the camp. This was who was there. There were approximately 31,500. Virtually every nationality and ethnic group in Europe was there, but far and away the biggest group were 9,000 Poles, about 4,000 Russians, 4,000 French, about 4,000 Czechs and Slovaks, 2,500 Jews, German nationals, Belgians, Dutch. There were prisoners there from the Spanish Civil War back in the 30s, who probably spent their entire time in Germany at Dachau. There were communists who were rounded up in Munich in 1933 who roamed from Dachau in May of 1945. They survived all 12 years. They went in as a cell. They had the discipline and the camaraderie of the cell. You'll see there were 6 Americans. One of these was a Major Giraud. He had parachuted into occupied France, was captured. This was before D-Day, and was captured, and he ended up there. This is the famous SS slogan, Arbeit macht frei, that was on most of the gates in the SS camps. Freedom through work, or work will make you free. It was, of course, a cruel hoax. It held out the notion that if you come in and work hard and are industrious, you can gain your freedom. This is a scene of the barracks looking across the moat. These are the same ones we saw earlier. I think that, from what I've been able to learn, and it isn't very definite, that Dachau was built in 1937 when it was rebuilt to house approximately 7,500 prisoners. There were more than 4 times that there, and though there was just god-awful overcrowding. Out in the perimeter, there were happy prisoners, happy to be liberated. Waiting scene there. Here are men of my rifle company fishing an SS body out of the moat. This is almost certainly one of the 8 guards that was shot while all the prisoners are looking on. And this is a prisoner here helping these 2 GIs. In fact, John, he has an X on his back. Do you remember what that meant?
That meant that these people we watched, specifically watched because because of escape danger, that they might escape all of the problem inmates.
John says that the X here indicates that the SS looked upon them as problem inmates and needed special attention. We now know that the SS at Dachau ran out of fuel several days before the liberation, and they shut down the crematorium. Periodically, you'll hear reference made to people finding warm ovens at Dachau. That's very improbable, in as much as they did not operate for several days. The consequence of this is that the SS at Dachau in the final days, and these are the notoriously efficient SS, literally had no way disposing of the bodies. And bodies they had, typhus now was rampant in the camp. As you saw, they were arriving dead in boxcars from other camps, and the response of the SS is just to line them out on the ground or pile them in huge piles. These scenes were taken by Signal Corps cameramen. There were 2 Signal Corps camera teams there, one with the 45th Division, one with the 42nd. Each one had a still photographer, each one had a motion picture, so there is an extensive photographic record of this. And we come to the crematorium. This is obviously taking place sometime later because that fellow was in the 3rd Division and they weren't there that day, so he has come back later on to take a look. One of our fellows in our regiment was Polish speaking from Chicago, and he went back the next day with the camera, and he got some of the Polish prisoners to reenact for him the procedure for disposing of the bodies. Here's another picture. I think some of you have seen this. This is John Steiner. Rather awkward posture there. He has lost most of the toes on one foot, parts of the toes on another feet. on those really cruel train rides. John arrived at Dachau in one of the boxcars, like you saw, 3 months before we got there. And there were very few survivors. John was one of the survivors. This is Colonel O'Brien. He was the commanding officer of my regiment. Obviously, he'd come back. This is later in May when John is up and around and he's giving him a tour. These are Signal Corps photos of the roundup of the guards. Here's the GIs and the guards. Another photo. This is Bill Walsh. He's the commanding officer of I Company. Earlier that day, he had taken 4 guards into a building and shot them. He later that day had a breakdown and was relieved of his command by the commander until he could get himself together again. This fellow is Captain Loy. He was the 3rd Battalion chaplain. He was the Protestant chaplain in there that day. There was a tendency of the prisoners to wrap themselves in red flags, to make Red Cross flags to pretend that they were medical staff or others. We now know that in the course of rounding up several hundred guards, a breakdown of discipline from different unrelated incidents in the camp among some of the soldiers for a while, during which about 3 dozen guards were killed, presumably unnecessarily. Some of them certainly unnecessarily, and presumption for many others. Here's another shot of the guards. They found, these are the SS thing, they found the guards there were in 4 different SS uniforms. There was Hungarian SS, Ukrainian SS, I don't know what the others were. And we come to a famous scene. I want to get a light here because I'm going to read something. Anybody know what I should be doing? Anybody know what I should be doing here? Oh, here, I think I got it. Yeah, okay, fine, thank you. This is I Company, the Signal Corps film taken with I Company in the act of shooting the guards. Here's the hospital with the Red Cross on the roof. Here's the masonry wall. Crumpled along the base of the wall, you'll see bodies. This is just or while the firing was taking place. This fella is on a .30 caliber machine gun, one from M Company. M Company was the 3rd Battalion's heavy weapons company who accompanied them in there. We know who every one of these GIs is. After the firing stopped, many of these people along the wall stood up. Some were killed, some were wounded. Many of them were not hit at all. They had do what I had done, and that is they had dropped. Now this fellow right here is John Lee. He was a BAR gunner in the 2nd Platoon of I Company, and he recently sent me his account of his whole time at Dachau, and I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from his description of what's taking place here. John is alive and well, lives in the Cleveland area. I was ordered by Lieutenant Walsh, commanding officer of I Company, to keep my BAR, that's a Browning automatic rifle, trained on the SS troopers, lined up at the wall. He said to keep them in place, and if they didn't, stay back to fire at them. At first, there were a few riflemen and myself guarding this large group of SS troopers, approximately 60, who were acting arrogant and defiant of the orders to stay back. Keep their hands up. Some did, but many just folded their arms, remarks in German. Some of the GIs, still visibly upset
what they had seen in the railroad cars, cursed and shouted for the SS to, quote, keep their goddamn hands up and stay back, unquote. Lieutenant Bushyhead, who was the executive officer of I Company, was there with Lieutenant Walsh, and both were still visibly upset. Lieutenant Walsh called for the M Company machine gun to set up facing the prisoners and to fire at them and stay back. The gunner loaded the belt in the machine gun and pulled back the lever to cock the gun to ready it for firing if needed. The SS troopers, seeing the machine gun cocked, thought that they were going to be shot, panicked, and started towards us. That's when someone yelled fire, and the machine gun opened up with a short burst of fire, and 3 riflemen and myself responded. Colonel Felix Sparks, the battalion commander, has written up his account, and he explains that he has just left this area to return to the protective custody area, and he hasn't gone long, and he hears machine gun fire. After I had walked away for a short distance, this is a lieutenant colonel, the battalion commander of I Company, of the 3rd Battalion. After I had walked away for a short distance, I heard the machine gun prisoners open fire. I immediately ran back to the gun and kicked the gunner off the gun with my boot. I then grabbed him by the collar and said, "What the hell are you doing?" He was a young private, about 19 years old, and was crying hysterically. His reply to me was, "Colonel, they were trying to get away." I doubt that they were, but in any event, he killed about 12 of the prisoners and wounded several more. I placed a sergeant on the gun and headed back toward the confinement area. Take a look now at where this wall meets the sky, that dot and that prisoner. There's the dot, there's the prisoner, there's the machine gunner. That is Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks doing what he said he had done, trying to stop the killing of the guards. In the photo that this is taken from, you can see that the chamber of his revolver is empty, which means he's fired 7 shots in the air trying to get these guys to stop. Well, you're not supposed to shoot unarmed prisoners of war. So there was a big investigation. An awful lot of people knew it had happened. Because troops of both the 45th and the 42nd Division were involved, they had to go to the next highest level, which was the 7th Army. And a Colonel Whitaker from the Inspector General's office of the 7th Army conducted the investigation. He interviewed all the officers and enlisted men of I Company, most of those from the 42nd Division. He recommended that Walsh, Bushyhead, other officers and enlisted men be charged with murder. He recommended that others be charged with having failed to stop the killing after it had started. And there was a battalion surgeon in there, Dr. Buechner, and he wanted to charge him with having failed to address the wounds after they were shot. Let me say this. The threat of this prosecution hung over these troops for a good part of the summer of 1945. That report had originated in the 7th Army, but shortly after we get to Munich, the 45th and the 42nd Division are transferred to the 3rd Army. Patton is in charge of that, now in effect the commanding officer of the Army of Occupation of Bavaria. Eventually, no charges were filed, and all the evidence was destroyed, including every known copy of the Inspector General's report. But in 1991, just 10 years ago, a copy of it was discovered in the National Archives. It's pages 8.5 by 14. It's about 2-3 inches thick. It's just one interview after another with the enlisted officers there. I want to read to you just one quick paragraph. and this is Colonel Whitaker writing, in the coal yard at the power plant, which is the same yard shown in the photograph, I found 17 bodies. All were in German uniform, and most of them had SS insignia on their uniform. One man's forehead had been crushed. A finger had been completely severed body. From another body, a finger had been severed at the second joint. All bodies indicated gunshot wounds. Apparently, the corporal in my community got 2 rings. I don't know, somebody else got one, obviously. That summer, Sparks, who was the officer in charge for the 45th Division, is ordered to go in and report to General George Patton. And he gets in there, and I'll read it what he says. The following morning, I reported to General Patton as Chief of Staff and arranged for an appointment with the General that afternoon. At the appointed time, I reported to the General. He then said to me, Colonel, I have some serious court-martial charges against you and some of your here on my desk. I replied that I had never been advised of any specific charges, but that I would like to offer an explanation of the events that took place at Dachau. The General paused for a moment and then said, there's no point to an explanation. I've already had these charges investigated and they're a bunch of crap. And you just hear Patton saying that. He would have used a little more descriptive language. I'm going to tear up these goddamn papers, you and your men. With a flourish, he tore up the papers lying in front of him and threw them in a wastebasket. He then said, you've been a damn fine soldier, now go home. I saluted and left. The whole interview lasted perhaps 3 minutes. It turns dark. I have spent my entire time up in this area. I never saw the protected custody area. I never saw the crematorium. I saw some of the big mounds of corpses. There were over 8,000 corpses at Dachau, including the railroad. I had often wondered through the years why I had no recollection of doing guard duty at Dachau. We always did guard duty any time you're near the front, and I would have remembered that. I've subsequently learned that C Company, my company, was relieved that early evening by I Company. Unusual. We've gone in to relieve I Company, and later that day I Company relieves us. The reason we had gone in there was that the original plan was that I Company would liberate the camp and then rejoin the 1st Battalion, and they were leading the attack on our sector on Munich. Because of what happened to I Company, there was a change in plans. It was now determined that my battalion, the 1st Battalion, would lead the attack in our area, and they wanted us back with them. I've subsequently found quite a few of the guys that were in my company and discovered that most of them, after we were relieved, walked back over to the town of Dachau and slept in homes. I don't know who made these decisions, but fellas in my platoon slept right in one of these single-family homes right here. These are the homes for the senior SS officers. The rest of these are apartments. These homes were in a wooded area. You can see beautiful green lawns, flower beds. Inside you had upholstered furniture. On the walls you had prints of famous pictures. My recollection is we talked till about midnight. Most of us were about 19. We knew we'd seen something mind-boggling. And my recollection is that one of the things we couldn't get over was the contrast between our quarters here and the total depravity in the rest. We just could not comprehend that. We were sleeping here in general luxury, and John Steiner and 31,000 others were over here, and another 8,000 corpses who did not survive. I believe the figures are that about 2,000 of the 31,500 who were liberated died the days following because they were so far gone. I have had a reunion with several of the fellows who were with me that night in the SS officers' quarters. One of them is our platoon sergeant, Ben Ewing, a friend of mine. His recollection of that night is going up in the second floor of one of these buildings, finding a children's nursery. And he said, I've never forgotten that there on the floor were children's toys and on the wall a crucifix. He just said, I've never been able to get that out of my mind. Well, from discussions with these other guys who had seen much more the camp than I had, I said to myself, boy, I better get out there first thing in the morning and get a look at this place, because I had really had a restricted participation. I had maintained a security post up here. Men were out rounding up guards. I saw 2 guards rounded up by our men that I Company had missed. I don't know. I don't think there were very many. In effect, we were mopping up. But the next morning, we were out of there before dawn, so I never had a chance to see any of this. And we are heading for Munich. And we are having to catch up with the rest of the 1st Battalion. We leave before dawn and we're walking very briskly. And in the middle of the morning, we come up to this picket fence. When we arrive, these prisoners are not in evidence. There's nothing there. And if nothing happened, I'm sure we would have just walked right on by. But all of a sudden, the 8,000 prisoners behind that fence discovered we were the U.S. Army. And I'll tell you, all hell broke loose. There's one big celebration, and it's one of the really more joyous experiences of my life. You can see the prisoners are in better shape than they were at Dachau. This is the slave labor camp at Allach, A-L-L-A-C-H. A very famous place. There was a BMW there that assembled Stuka engines for the Luftwaffe planes. This was, in effect, a sub-camp of Dachau. The 8,000 prisoners that were here had all come from Dachau at one time or another. Also, there were conscripted laborers from the occupied countries. One of my neighbors up in Roseville was from Rotterdam. He had been in a concentration camp, and then he'd been released. He went home, and he was then conscripted to the Munich area. He was working in this same camp, completely separate from the prisoners, but in the same one. Despite the fact that they were in better shape, we gave them all of our food, all our cigarettes, all our candy. We left there, we didn't have a single bit of food left. One of our guys threw a cigar over the fence. That only happened once. There was a damnedest fight, and by the time it was done, the cigar was just in shreds. These prisoners pointed out to us that right over here was a potato store. Potatoes had been stored. And so we let them out, and they'd come over and get the potatoes and go back. And then the officers told us that we couldn't let them out. Remember, seal it off, don't let anybody in or out. And so we went over and dug potatoes, and we threw them over the fence. The fellow here is George Babel. He was the runner in my platoon. I've not been able to find him or account for him. This is Arthur Tarati. He was a rifleman in the 1st Platoon of C Company. He's alive and well up in the boonies above Duluth, Minnesota. We've not been able to recall or find out who these 2 people are. Many of these prisoners spoke English, and I remember talking to an older gentleman who was from Warsaw. He said he was a physician, and that because he was a doctor, he had been treated more leniently by the Germans and had not been made to work as hard as the others. One of the fellows in our platoon, a sergeant in our company, was Leonard Poppich. He was from a devout Jewish family in Munich. 2 days later in Munich, he writes a long letter home to his family. And I've had some good reunions with Leonard, and I'd just like to share with you a brief excerpt from this letter. This is taking place here at Balak, a Jewish man came up to me and asked me if it were true that there were Jewish soldiers in the American army. When I told him that I was a Jewish Unteroffizier, he was a staff sergeant, he nearly went mad. Soon I had about 50 Jewish men and women around me, hugging and kissing me. They were starved also for das Yiddish Gist, which I believe is translated as the Jewish spirit. And I wanted so much to make them happy. I sang some Chassonish Shtikla, which I believe are musical ditties for them, and also a Jewish mother. One asked me if I wouldn't write my Jewish name for him on a piece of paper. Soon I was for them on dirty scraps of paper that appeared in their hands like magic. They all wanted it as a souvenir from the first American Jewish soldier they had ever seen. In 1995, in the spring, April 30th, 1995, the Jewish community in San Francisco honored veterans who liberate camp, veterans from Northern California, and they tracked down something about 120 of us, and they had a lovely, it was a remembrance day at Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. And the fellow in charge of it, was Bill Lowenberg, a prominent member of the San Francisco business community. And each of us who had participated had been asked to submit a brief little description of our experiences. And after the lunch, Bill Lowenberg comes over to our table and said, "Which one of you is Doughtery?" And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "50 years ago today, you liberated me at a lock." And there is, I have to get pretty close. There is Bill Lowenberg, right there. He subsequently, like John, was able to come to this country. Well, my recollection is that we were there about 3 or 4 hours, which meant we would have been left sometime in the middle of the afternoon or maybe early afternoon. We are now approaching very close to Munich, and we are coming with great apprehension because we just figured that it was going to be a repeat of Nuremberg, where we had fought for 5 days, where we had lost 3 killed in action there. And no one was volunteering for anybody, anything. The war was almost over. Nobody wanted to be a casualty. And so we were absolutely delighted to discover that day that Munich was not defended. And the first units of the 42nd and the 45th Division had arrived early that morning with no opposition. We come along later in the afternoon. We are entering Munich, my recollection is, on a very wide boulevard with a broad median strip down the middle. We walked parallel to that median strip for many blocks, and it was strewn, the median strip was strewn with German army paraphernalia. Helmets, coats, boots, rifles, canteens, entrenching tools. It's very clear that when the Germans, the SS and the Wehrmacht who were there, were going to have to defend, discovered they were not going to be defending it, they all promptly changed into civvies, dumped all their stuff out in the street. The next day, much to our delight, it is announced, this is now May 1st, 1945, it is announced immediately that the 45th Division, that's us, will occupy Munich. And that meant that for us, the war was over. This is May 1st, the war ends May 8th, just a week later. But that meant that for us, there wasn't going to be any possibility of anybody else. There were large sections of Munich that were heavily bombed, but there were also large residential areas in good shape. This is Nymphenburg Castle and Nymphenburg Park, for those of you who are familiar with Munich. And right here at the corner of Lochner and Renatestrasse, we went up to this home. We were told that for housing we were to commandeer private homes. We went up to this house, knocked on the door, and Baroness von Schachner comes to the door. She's a widow, older lady. And Ben Ewing, the platoon sergeant, said, "Ma'am, we are going to billet troops in your home. We'll give your family one bedroom in the kitchen, and we're going to take the rest of the house." And she said, "Okay." Spoke very good English. We went across the street to this house, and Herr Steimer, Frau Steimer, and two very good-looking teenage daughters about my under the door. Edith and Ilse Steimer. Edith speaks fluent English. And the sergeant says to them, "We are going to billet troops in your home. We will give your family one bedroom in the kitchen. We're going to take the rest of the house." And Edith translates this to her father, and he goes, "Nine, nine, 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 nine." The reason I remember that, in fact, when I had my reunion with the Ben Ewing, I said, "Do you remember what you said after that?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, what you said was, ma'am, you explained to your father that if this is not a satisfactory arrangement, we will take your entire house and your family can go live in Dachau." That, of course, ended the discussion. And I cite that to suggest a rather somber tone in the company having just 2 days away from Dachau and 1 day away from Malak, and how quickly things changed. We occupied Munich for 6 weeks. Within a couple of weeks, you've got GI shacked up with German gals. The Army didn't care where you slept as long as you showed up for guard duty. The attraction for the women, of course, was that we had food. And the civilian food supply at that point was very, very slim. When we left 6 weeks later on a train, Helmsburg, there were an awful lot of Fräuleins there crying and weeping and saying goodbye. I don't know if you know what occupying armies do, but you guard. First of all, you get souvenirs. Here's a fellow getting Adolf Hitler Strasse, a street sign off of a building. You guard things that can be looted. Museums, foodstuffs, bakeries. And in Munich, we guarded the ones of Munich. I don't have to tell you what happened. Putting the 45th Division in charge of the wine cellars of Munich, like putting the fox in the hen house. I was a sergeant, so I didn't have to do guard duty. I made up the list. And I was a teetotaler at the time. And I spent a lot of time putting drunken GIs to bed. They would come off duty drunk from guarding the wine cellars. We leave Augsburg we left for Augsburg 6 weeks later, and we always claimed that the reason we left was that they had drunk the wine cellar dry, and we had to move on to another time. This is the Hofbrauhaus, the famous beer hall. Right here, you can't see it very well. 157th Infantry Regiment. One of the guys in our regiment backed a Jeep up there with some paint and painted that on there. This is a very historic place. It was in this building in the 1920s that Hitler organized the German Workers' Party, which would eventually go on to become the National Socialist Party. Small little organizational meetings took place in this building, and during the Third Reich, this building was a Nazi shrine. By the time we arrived, I've had to write about it in my newsletter. They found it a total mess inside, but I've now found 2 different guys who got beer steins and still have them as souvenirs.